fall of Sodom did not begin with an impact tearing through the clouds. Its foundation began to crumble decades earlier in the exact moment economic prosperity erased the moral compass of its inhabitants. To understand what drew such a devastating force to the Jordan River Valley, we must look at the geography of power in that era. The plain was not just visually stunning. It hid a resource in the soil that was worth its weight in gold in antiquity: bitumen. In the Bronze Age, this thick and highly flammable substance was the backbone of heavy industry. It was the equivalent of modern oil. It was used intensely to seal ships, strengthen the mortar of colossal temples, and prepare heavy weaponry. The cities that dominated this fertile valley formed a powerful confederation, and Sodom was the central jewel of this military and commercial alliance. The monopoly over the bitumen pits created an endless flow of wealth. Caravans crossed the desert, bringing spices from Egypt and the depths of Asia to trade for this essential commodity. And where money flows without restrictions, military power quickly rises to build fortresses. Sodom ceased to be a mere peaceful settlement, transforming into an engine of war and relentless diplomacy. Its massive wood and bronze gates witnessed the entry of merchants, ambassadors, and kings, all seeking favors from the elite who controlled the regional economy. Secular history and biblical texts document that such a concentration of wealth caught the attention of distant empires. Powerful kings united in a massive coalition to subjugate the cities of the plain, resulting in a severe international conflict. It was the clash of four great monarchs against the alliance of five local kings. Sodom knew the bitterness of invasion and had its assets confiscated, but its civil structure survived. The valley recovered with astonishing speed. The problem is that this resilience generated a catastrophic psychological effect on the people. The reconstruction brought a false sense of unlimited power. The residents began to believe that their formidable walls and constant economy made them bulletproof against any misfortune. A city that survives the siege of the greatest armies of the known world begins to see itself as untouchable. With material security guaranteed, the irreversible collapse of internal humanity occurred. The corruption inside those walls was not silent, nor was it practiced only in the shadows of the alleys. The absence of empathy and tyranny became the actual legal and social system in place. Ancient customs dictated that hospitality to the outsider was the ultimate rule of survival in the Middle East. In Sodom, this rule was subverted. The traveler seeking shelter after sunset did not find rest in hot food. He found systemic humiliation and institutionalized perversion. The collective pride of the city demanded the degradation of the weakest. Abundance generated a life of idleness, and that idleness anesthetized any remaining trace of justice. High in the stony and arid mountains of Canaan, the patriarch Abraham observed the smoke of the forges and the busy movement of the valley from a distance. He opted for the rigidity of canvas tents instead of the corrupted comfort of polished stones. But the attention of his nephew, Lot, was captured by a dangerous mirage. At the moment of dividing the grazing routes, Lot fixed his eyes on the green plain of the Jordan and ignored the ethical abyss that hid beneath that wealth. Attracted by the financial stability and the monumental infrastructure, he moved his camp gradually. He kept pitching his tents closer and closer to the city, approach after approach, until the magnetic comfort dragged him definitively inside the gates of Sodom. Lot established his family nucleus in the epicenter of that generation's power. He prospered in commerce and sat at the city gate, a respected position reserved for judges and influential citizens. However, his sanity fought an exhausting battle against his environment. He was a righteous man, living the daily torture of trying to preserve his integrity in a society that openly celebrated depravity and disrespect for human life. The loud noise of the markets and diplomatic meetings on the terraces muffled the silence of the night, and the population of Sodom continued to toast their own invincibility. No one looked at the clouds with apprehension. What they ignored was that the same land saturated with bitumen and volatile gases that guaranteed them the top of civilization was silently preparing to become the geological furnace of their absolute end. Extreme wealth has the power to alter the psychology of an entire nation. To understand the mind of a citizen of Sodom on the eve of their annihilation, one must first examine the dark soil that paved their economy. The plain of the Jordan River, known in antiquity as the Valley of Siddim, was not just an agricultural miracle. It housed a geological resource that transformed those city-states into true commercial powers, the bitumen pits. In the Bronze Age, this thick and highly flammable substance was the most coveted material for heavy engineering and military conflicts. It was used to seal ships, strengthen large walls, and waterproof cisterns. Whoever controlled the bitumen controlled the rhythm of progress in the ancient world, and Sodom controlled the bitumen. The king of Sodom, named Bera, ruled the most influential city of a confederation of 5 local monarchs. The constant flow of merchants, caravans, and diplomats filled the city's coffers with gold, silver, and fine fabrics. The buildings ceased to be modest and began to reflect the ostentation of an elite that knew no limits. Colossal gates of wood and bronze were erected. The markets overflowed with spices imported from Egypt and deep Asia. But secular history and ancient records show that dizzying abundance also attracts predators. Such a concentration of wealth did not go unnoticed by the great empires of the East. For 12 years, the cities of the plain were forced to pay heavy tributes to an alliance of 4 distant monarchs, led by Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam. It was an international extortion. In the 13th year, confident in their insurmountable walls and their own military power, the 5 kings of the valley decided to rebel and cut the payment. The response was relentless. In the 14th year, the forces of the East marched on the plain of the Jordan. The clash that followed was a tactical disaster for Sodom. The kings of the valley tried to use the terrain in their favor, but the same geography that enriched them became their ruin. In the attempt to retreat, many fell into the dense bitumen pits. The local army was crushed, and the city was harshly invaded. Goods were confiscated, and many inhabitants were taken as captives, including Abraham's nephew Lot, who had chosen to dwell there. The Hebrew narrative reports that Abraham came down from the mountains with 318 trained men, intercepted the invaders in the dead of night, and recovered both the people and the riches. What happened right after this rescue is the key to understanding the definitive moral collapse of Sodom. When the king of the city offered the recovered goods to Abraham as a reward, the patriarch refused categorically. He declared that he would not even keep the strap of a sandal, so that the king could never say that he had enriched Abraham. It was a frontal rejection of the corrupted system of that civilization. Abraham returned to the simplicity and righteousness of his tents in the mountains. Lot, however, took the opposite path. He returned inside the stone walls. Instead of learning the hard lesson with the invasion and the near loss of their freedom, the elite of Sodom became even more arrogant. They had been rescued, their riches were restored, and their defenses rebuilt. The feeling of invulnerability took over the streets. Centuries later, the prophet Ezekiel diagnosed the disease of that civilization with surgical precision. He did not just cite the acts that made them infamous, but the root of the problem. Ezekiel pointed out that the ruin of Sodom was built on three essential pillars: extreme pride, overabundance of food, and prosperous idleness. They had plenty, they made no effort at all, and they closed their hands to the poor and needy. In the ancient Middle East, the desert is a relentless environment, and the law of hospitality was considered the most sacred of human duties. Offering water, food, and shelter to an outsider was literally the difference between life and a tragic end in the sands. Sodom took this millennial law and inverted it completely. The outsider ceased to be a guest to be protected and began to be treated as prey. Cruelty became an institution defended by the city's own leaders. The pride of those people demanded the humiliation of the other. It was a society of predators dressed in fine linen, where compassion was seen as an intolerable weakness, and exploitation was the mark of success. While the city sank in its own structural decay, Lot consolidated his position. He no longer lived in tents on the outskirts. The texts indicate that he was sitting at the gate of Sodom. In the social architecture of the time, the city gate was the equivalent of the city hall and the courthouse. It was there that big deals were closed and judgments were handed down. Lot had become a judge, a figure of authority within an unsustainable administration. His mind was in constant conflict, tormented by the acts he witnessed daily. But his financial and family roots were too deep in the dark and contaminated soil of the plain. He tolerated the intolerable for the comfort of the walls. But the bill of human pride has a strict expiration date. While the merchants closed their deals at dusk, and the citizens prepared for another night of excesses under the false security of their fortresses, the sun began to set over the Jordan Valley. A fine dust rose on the horizon of the main road. The corruption of generations had reached its absolute limit, and the messengers of the final intervention were already walking towards the city gates. Before we advance to the narrow streets of Sodom and witness the most terrifying and oppressive night of the ancient world, I quickly ask for your like. It helps this documentary reach more people and greatly values all the historical and archaeological research work done to bring this information to you. And for me to better know who's watching today, leave your answer in the comments. Are you a Christian and participate in any church? Do you like to study the artifacts and events of the Bible on your own? Or are you simply passionate about ancient history and archaeology? I will read and answer each comment with great affection. Thank you very much for the support. Now, let's return to the gates of the plain. The sun hid behind the mountains of Canaan, and the shadows swallowed the narrow streets of Sodom. The suffocating heat of the plain used to announce the beginning of an agitated nightlife, financed by the gold of the bitumen and the idleness of its inhabitants. It was exactly on this threshold between light and darkness that two outsiders crossed the main gates. They appeared to be just exhausted travelers, but the arrival of these two men would trigger a brutal tension mechanism that would extinguish the city before the next dawn. Lot was sitting at the city gate, the center of political decisions, when he spotted the strangers. His reaction was not just that of a polite host, it was the reaction of a man on high alert. He ran towards them, bowed down, and insisted they spend the night under his safe roof. Lot knew the dark machinery of that place. He knew that the squares of Sodom were not places of rest, they were ruthless traps. To let two strangers sleep in the open was to hand them over to a cruel fate. The travelers accepted the invitation. The doors of Lot's house were locked with iron bolts. Water was served, unleavened bread was baked, and for a brief moment it seemed that the law of shelter had triumphed. But the silence lasted little. The rumor of new prey spread through the alleys with a terrifying speed. Before they could seek rest, a muffled sound echoed outside. Heavy steps, hundreds of them. Fists began to beat against the thick wood. When Lot looked through the cracks, the vision was the reflection of absolute human collapse. It was not an isolated group. The ancient records state that men from all parts of the city, young and old, formed a uniform mass in the darkness. The entire city closed ranks. The demand they shouted broke any morality. They did not want gold or riches. They demanded that the visitors be handed over to suffer humiliation and extreme physical violence. The pride of Sodom dictated that no outsider pass without being subjected to the oppressive power of its citizens. What follows is one of the most claustrophobic scenes in ancient history. Lot made a desperate decision. He opened the door and went out, closing it quickly behind his back. He stood alone, unarmed, facing the predatory crowd. He tried to appeal to reason in a place where it no longer existed. The despair of that family father was so extreme that his fractured mind reached the point of offering his own daughters to appease the fury, a dark bargain. But the crowd did not want negotiation. The hatred quickly turned against Lot. The mass advanced with force to crush the door and run over him. In the exact second that the hands of the crowd would drag him into the stone streets, the door opened from the inside out. The travelers extended their arms, pulled Lot to safety, and locked the entrance definitively. And then the first physical blow fell on the plain of the Jordan. An intense light hit the men outside, wounding everyone with a heavy and immediate blindness. The terrifying detail of that night is not the blindness. It is that, even deprived of vision, even facing a warning that they were dealing with forces beyond human comprehension, the men of Sodom did not retreat. The narrative reports that they continued groping the stone walls in the dark, obsessed with finding the doorknob. Evil consumed them much more than the fear of imminent punishment. Inside the house, the identity of the travelers was finally exposed. They were not lost merchants. They were messengers with an irrevocable order. The outcry against the perversity of Sodom had reached its maximum limit. The city, its walls, and the entire valley would be completely undone in the coming hours. The warning was cold and cutting. Gather everyone who belongs to your family and leave this place right now. The early morning advanced relentlessly. Lot ran through the dark streets to warn his future sons-in-law. He knocked on their doors, announcing the absolute end of everything they knew. The response sealed the fate of that generation. They laughed. For those young men, raised in the comfort of the wide walls, the idea that the invincible metropolis could be extinguished sounded like a joke told by a scared old man. The wealth of the city blinded them long before the messengers dazzled the eyes of the crowd. Lot returned empty-handed. The sky on the horizon of the desert began to gain the first tones of gray-blue. Time had run out. However, amidst the panic of packing the few belongings, Lot hesitated. He looked at the accumulated stability, at the life built in the epicenter of that empire. The lethargy of attachment almost cost him his existence. Seeing that the sunlight already threatened to break, the celestial messengers firmly grabbed the hands of Lot, his wife, and his daughters. The physical grip ripped them from the city. The last command echoed as their feet touched the sand outside. Run for your lives. Do not look back under any circumstances, and do not stop on the plain. Now, let's witness the disintegration of Sodom. The final warning of the messengers was definitive. Flee to the stone mountains, do not stop on the plain, and under no circumstances look back. Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters ran desperately along the ancient sand routes while the sun began to rise on the distant horizon. That dawn, however, did not bring the soft, golden light that used to bathe the Jordan River Valley. The sky took on a sickly, grayish hue. The air became thick, heavy, almost impossible to breathe. What was about to happen over those plains would not be a severe storm or a military conflict between nations. It would be an event of thermal annihilation so extreme that it would leave geological scars on the face of the planet for millennia. In the ancient records, the description of the events is both poetic and terrifying. The sacred text states that brimstone and fire came down from the heavens. For centuries, much of the world read these lines as a mere figure of speech. However, when we cross these ancient texts with the evidence embedded in the soil of the Middle East, the metaphor disappears quickly. It gives way to an absolute and palpable physical reality. Modern science raises disturbing hypotheses that explain the mechanics of this catastrophe, and they all converge to a thermal anomaly of immeasurable proportions. One of the lines of investigation suggests a sudden cosmic explosion, a celestial body that did not directly collide with the Earth's crust, but detonated in the lower atmosphere, generating a displacement of superheated air with incalculable force. Another possibility points to a violent tectonic failure under the plain, which tore the Earth and released under extreme pressure the immense reserves of confined gases and the vast underground bitumen pits. The result would be a colossal eruption of highly flammable material launched into the skies, which then rained back down on the civilization. Whether originated in the dark clouds or by the fractured bowels of the Earth, the final impact was the same. An insurmountable furnace was opened over the valley. In an immeasurable instant, a blinding flash dozens of times brighter than the midday sun tore the firmament over Sodom, Gomorrah, and the neighboring cities. There was no time for prolonged despair. There was no time for the watchmen in the towers to sound the bronze alarms. The temperature of the surrounding air rose abruptly to thousands of degrees. Physics explains what happens when a mass of air reaches this level of extreme and sudden heat. The oxygen is violently sucked from the entire environment, creating an asphyxiating vacuum that precedes the true final blow. Right after came the shock wave, an invisible wall of oppressive pressure and scorching air, moving at speeds well above the breaking of the sound barrier, swept the plane from one end to the other. The formidable stone walls and the thick clay bricks did not just crumble, they were physically crushed. The most advanced urban infrastructure of that era was leveled down to its deep foundations as if it were made of fragile dust. The large, solid wooden gates, unquestionable symbols of the local elite's economic power, melted in a fraction of seconds under the relentless thermal bombardment. For the tens of thousands of inhabitants of those imposing metropolises, the end was not a long and painful siege. Organic biology simply does not support this degree of temperature anomaly. The people, the great caravans of merchants, the fruit trees, and even the water contained in the wells did not enter into common combustion. They were disintegrated. Matter evaporated before the formidable heat, even before the human central nervous system could register the perception of danger. The unbreakable pride of that civilization met its end under the weight of a relentless force. The very ground they stepped on boiled intensely. The fine sand of the region, under the continuous pressure of such violent heat, fused irrevocably and transformed into solid plates of green and gray glass. The entire geography was altered. Far from there, in the safe mountains, the patriarch Abraham rose at the break of day and walked with heavy steps to the exact point where he had interceded hours before. The dark and dense smoke rose from the entire length of the valley, obscuring the sunlight like the soot of a colossal furnace. Silence descended upon the ruins. Events of biblical proportions like the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah are not just isolated tales lost in the dust of time. The Bible is not just a book, it is a library of 66 works, written over approximately 1,500 years. So that you can visualize the complete scenario and connect these impressive facts, I created the ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order. Understanding the historical sequence of biblical events allows the reader to see prophetic connections. From creation to the apocalypse, biblical history extends for over 6,000 years of narrative. The link for you to acquire your copy and master the entire sacred timeline is down here, in the first pinned comment and in the description. The final warning was not to look back. While Lot and his daughters forced their muscles to the limit on the steep climb of the dark rocks of the Canaan mountains, the air behind them transformed into a furnace of extreme pressure. The Jordan River plain no longer existed as a functional ecosystem or an established trade route. What rose from the boiling ground was a formidable cloud of superheated ashes and lethal gases, expanding in all directions, with a force that organic biology cannot withstand. The deafening noise of the disintegration echoed through the arid valley, a terrifying mixture of supersonic winds and heavy matter being pulverized against the ground. In the middle of this absolute and deafening chaos, hesitation took its definitive toll. Lot's wife, moved by the psychological weight of a whole life left behind, slowed her pace and stopped. The deep attachment to the built material wealth, the paralyzing shock of seeing her world collapse, or simply the lack of control over her own fear made her break the only rule of survival imposed by the messengers that early morning. She turned to look. For many centuries, Popular tradition treated this tense moment as a magical punishment, a literal conversion of flesh into sodium chloride by simple disobedience. But when we analyze the event under the hard lens of the physical and thermal horror of that morning, reality proves to be infinitely more frightening. The Jordan River Valley and the shores of the ancient Dead Sea housed one of the largest concentrations of saline minerals and bitumen on the entire planet. When the thermal anomaly descended upon the cities, the extreme temperature did not just liquefy the walls. The brutal energy instantly vaporized millions of tons of water, raising the salt and minerals from the soil into the dark atmosphere. All of this formed a black and lethal pyroclastic cloud, similar to the shock wave that swallows metropolises during the most violent volcanic events in history. When Lot's wife braked her steps at the edge of the plain and turned her body to face the burning valley, she was swallowed by this asphyxiating expansion. The superheated air sucked all the moisture from her organism in a time interval too short for the perception of pain. The biology of death in this relentless scenario is unquestionable and fulminating. The relentless storm of ashes, sulfur, and vaporized salt covered her physical structure with the brutal impact of a thermal avalanche. The human body was dehydrated to the extreme limit and buried standing up, under thick layers of boiling mineral material. The narrative does not describe a poetic trick, but the physical result of someone hit head-on by the lethal perimeter of a colossal geological disaster. She became a rigid monument of her own lethargy. The physical horror of this annihilation shaped her tragic end, carving a perpetual warning into the sands. The blind attachment to the wealth of Sodom transformed a living person into a pillar, silenced forever. The sun finished its climb, illuminating a vast desert of salt and ashes. The dense sands of the Middle East are true specialists in keeping deep secrets. For centuries, critics and thinkers considered the account of the disintegration of Sodom just a legend created to teach moral precepts. But contemporary archaeology decided to dig deeper into the Jordan River plain, specifically in the vast region of Tal el-Hammam. What researchers found under feet of dusty earth was not a settlement abandoned by drought or consumed by common human conflicts. The soil revealed an incredibly thick and continuous layer of dark ashes, pointing to a terrifying conclusion. That central location, which flourished vigorously almost 2,000 years before Christ, suffered a sudden and absolute end. When experts of our century analyzed the ancient ruins, the scenario that emerged defied the team's understanding. The stone foundations of the great defensive walls had been leveled in a way that absolutely no army of antiquity could accomplish by their own hands. The colossal mechanical force necessary to flatten that infrastructure indicated a shock wave of extreme atmospheric pressure. But it was the thermal anomaly that silenced the skeptics inside the laboratories. Fragments of everyday pottery were taken from the black earth. They were not just broken or burned by common fire. The material boiled from the inside out. The surface of the clay pieces melted and transformed into pure green glass, an undeniable physical process that requires temperatures well over thousands of degrees Celsius. The organic biology found under the heavy layers of ashes told an even darker story. Modern excavators did not find organized burials or signs that the cities resisted a prolonged military siege. They found severely fragmented human remains scattered throughout the urban perimeter and disintegrated in tiny fractions of seconds. The millennial bones presented undeniable marks of a massive and fulminating thermal trauma. The exposure was so violent and relentless that people did not even have time to react, seek shelter, or protect their own faces from the lethal flash. The crossed mineral and structural evidence indicates that the oppressive heat that hit the Jordan Valley easily surpassed the extremely high temperatures found in the magma of a volcano in intense eruption. Investigative science spent long years mapping and testing the vitrified soil samples collected from the plain. The technical conclusion about the formidable impact that occurred exactly 3,600 years ago confirms the deep historical rigor of the ancient sacred texts. A monstrous physical anomaly indeed descended like an unstoppable furnace upon those cities of stone. The excavations undeniably prove that the astronomical wealth and monumental architecture of Sodom did not disappear in a slow decline at the hands of time. They were obliterated in the silent space of a single breath. In this remarkable case, advanced archaeology does not invalidate the Bible. It simply reveals to our generations how literal, physical, and devastating the cataclysm was that forever altered the inhospitable surface of that desert. The heavy smoke that rose from the Jordan River plain did not just mark the physical end of a formidable civilization. Far from that epicenter of annihilation, high in the mountains of Canaan, the patriarch Abraham remained in a deep silence. He directed his gaze to the long horizon where, until the previous night, the most envied metropolises of the ancient world stood. Not a single trace remained of the advanced engineering, the spice fairs, or the prosperous bitumen trade. Where once there was a green oasis overflowing with life, now remained only the mirror of dense waters of the Dead Sea and a sterile desert, permanently paved by dust, salt, and green glass. The cataclysm of Sodom remains the greatest warning of antiquity, undeniably carved into the geography of our planet. It is material and absolute proof that arrogance, systematic oppression, and blind belief in one's own invincibility have a limit. Those cities did not fall because they lacked sharp weapons or plenty of financial resources. They crumbled from the inside long before the fulminating thermal impact tore the clouds. The corruption of the collective soul and the loss of respect for life transformed the wealth of the valley into its own unbreakable tomb. Human pride, no matter how monumental it seems, can completely disappear in the space of a single dawn. However, the melted sands of the Middle East do not carry only a message of ruin. When we examine the precise accounts of the Bible, we realize that the tragic end of those cities serves to illuminate the extreme importance of redemption. The same history that shows us the severe consequences of moral collapse also reveals the incalculable value of genuine faith. The same faith that pulled Lot from the exact center of the disintegration. Many centuries later, Jesus himself would make reference to that terrifying dawn. He pointed to the ruins of the desert to highlight the urgency of salvation and the irrefutable and true weight of God's promises for the human mind. The brutal tragedy of that plain teaches us that the true fortress of a nation does not reside in the thickness of its bronze gates, but in the deep integrity of its people. In a world that frequently celebrates material pride above all things, the inexhaustible love of God and the guiding direction of the Holy Spirit remain the only unshakable shelters we have at our disposal. the intercessory prayer of Abraham, still resonates in the invisible echoes of history, reminding us that definitive hope is never in the physical stone constructions, but in the non-negotiable maintenance of our inner compass. May the glass desert and the ashes of that ancient civilization serve to remind us daily of what really matters and what remains standing when the storm passes. If this rigorous investigation brought value, mature reflection, and historical knowledge to you today, leave your like and subscribe to our channel. Share this material with those who also value historical precision and the undeniable weight of the Scriptures. A big hug, and until our next documentary,